Hello dear students, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy and good evening. Today is 1st May 2024 and we have few important news articles to discuss in this present lecture. And before discussing all of those important news articles, let's try to solve yesterday's practice question. You all know that yesterday I have given one practice question, that is, which of the following statements are correct about the Mount Ruang. So the options that are given here are: it is located in the Andes mountain range. Option B, it is an active volcano located in Indonesia. And option C, it is the highest peak in Africa. And option D, it is a mountain which is famous for its sky resorts. So the correct answer for this question is option B, it is an active volcano located in Indonesia. See, remember, this is very important question. You have to remember Mount Ruang and where it is located. So it is located in Indonesia and it is a volcano, and recently the volcanic eruption or explosion took place from Mount Ruang. So if we can briefly talk about this Mount Ruang, so it is actually a stratovolcano and that is located in the Indonesia's North Sulawesi province. And apart from that, it is 725-meter volcano, and the summit of this particular volcano stands at 10,932 feet above the sea level, right? So with a caldera that is about 2 miles wide. So the caldera of this particular Mount Ruang, a volcanic mountain, is around 2 miles wide. So these are some basic details about the Mount Ruang. Now today's practice question is: World Coral Conservatory Project is an initiative of which of the following organizations? So option A, United Nations Environment Program. Option B, IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. And option C, Worldwide Fund for Nature. And option D, none of the above. Please answer this question in the comment section and I'll be giving you the correct answer in tomorrow's lecture as well. So first important editorial that was given for today's discussion is: make EPI an essential program on immunization. See, this actually EPI meaning is that expanded program on immunization. Immunization is very important. So immunization actually helps us prevent the diseases, especially the vaccine preventable diseases can be prevented through this immunization program. So immunization of both children and adults plays a very important role, right? So when we administer vaccines to different age groups of people, we are actually immunizing them against the vulnerabilities that are posed by various diseases. For example, we have a program called Indradhanush. So Indradhanush is actually a program that ensures universal vaccination or universal immunization against 7 most fatal diseases among children. For example, MMR vaccine, polio vaccine. So all those vaccines would be administered under the Mission Indradhanush or immunization program. So however, the expanded immunization program is very important here, because expanded immunization program's overall objective is to ensure universal access to the immunization. Now, what is the context of this particular article? In the year 2024 actually marks the 50th anniversary of the expanded immunization program. So it was launched or started by the World Health Organization. So thereby prompting a reflection on the progress that is being made and the future direction of immunization programs, particularly in India. Now see, immunization in countries like India is very important, with a huge population and most of the population in the poor segment, because it would help them deal with new diseases, especially the vaccine preventable diseases, if we effectively immunize them. Okay, now we'll have to understand the progress and challenges of this expanded immunization program. Now, what is the present status of progress, and at the same time the challenges that the expanded immunization program has actually been facing? So if you look at the immunization program across the world and even India also, we very often witness a significant progress over the past 5 decades with respect to the immunization. So why we say that there is a significant progress in the immunization, because the immunization coverage has in fact significantly broadened. So different segments or different categories of the people are now effectively immunized, and at the same time the public health care system has actually further strengthened to identify these vaccine preventable diseases and start an immunization program. And at the same time, the capacities of the states with respect to manufacturing of these vaccines and administer the vaccines as part of their immunization programs have also significantly increased. And at the same time, the global collaboration with respect to vaccines and immunization have also yielded some positive results, and that helps us build the equity in vaccine delivery. So therefore, keeping in mind all these things, we can effectively say that in last 5 decades we have made a significant improvements with respect to immunization and administering vaccines. Okay, so now vaccines are being available for preventing a wide range of diseases. Now it was not the case 5 decades before. Okay, so now if you look at the immunization program of different countries, the immunization program actually covers a broader area of diseases. So thereby it prevents millions of deaths annually and even the hospitalizations as well. So that is in fact having a lot of multiplier effect in terms of reducing the out of pocket expenditure, out of pocket health expenditure, especially from the poor. So according to an estimate, the total expenditure of households on healthcare is more than 42%. So the total health expenditure on healthcare is more than 42%, and this expenditure is known as out of pocket expenditure. And this out of pocket expenditure is one of the highest, especially in a country like India, where we do not have a significant health insurance access or insurance penetration to a sizable number of our population. Okay, so however, in this case, immunization and vaccination have made a significant progress in the recent regard. Okay, so in the recent times, however, we are still facing a persisting challenges and even the inequalities or inequities as well. So when I say persistent challenges, there are some challenges that have to be addressed. So first challenge is that declining childhood immunization coverage. So declining childhood immunization coverage would in fact make them vulnerable to various diseases, and that could significantly increases the infant mortality rate. Okay, so and at the same time, in certain regions, it is very common that childhood immunization coverage or childhood vaccination is drastically declining. And at the same time, we should identify the inequalities or inequities in vaccine coverage, vaccine access by geography and socioeconomic factors remain. Now, when I say this vaccine equity, what does this vaccine equity exactly mean? So we have to take the example of the COVID-19 pandemic. So during COVID-19 pandemic, what different countries have done? For example, take the example of developed countries. So developed countries are actually acquired a lot of vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what they have done, they just have stockpiled these vaccines. They just stockpiled these vaccines, even though in fact they have procured these vaccines more than the actual demand of the vaccine. But on the other hand, if you go to the poor underdeveloped countries, they are lacking access to the vaccines. Okay, so even a single dose of vaccine was not available for people in those poor countries, especially countries in Africa, South America and South Asia. But on the other hand, if you look at the developed countries, so they have acquired more vaccines than their demand, and then they have stockpiled those vaccines also. So this is where the problem actually comes, and this is also creates a problem of vaccine inequity. So vaccine inequity is actually a challenge. However, in recent times, we have also seen a shift towards the adult vaccination as well, because the childhood vaccination, traditionally prioritized by the governments, And at the same time, there is also a growing recognition for the importance of the adult vaccination, especially considering increasing prevalence of vaccine preventable diseases among the adults. So these are certain shifts and challenges that are being associated with the existing vaccination or immunization programs. So however, how can we proceed forward in future? So there are certain recommendations that are being provided by the authors of this editorial. So what are those recommendations for future directions? First and foremost, we must expand the immunization coverage. We must broaden the existing immunization coverage. So for that, policy measures should actually focus on expanding the immunization coverage to include not only child but at the same time the adults and the elderly, so thereby building on success of childhood vaccination programs. Okay, see, the existing immunization programs is actually a success, there's no doubt about that. Especially we have focused on childhood immunization, but this childhood immunization is a success. Now we have to make it a platform. The childhood immunization program should be a platform to further increase the coverage, to make it more broader, so that we can cover elder, and at the same time we should also cover the adult population. Thereby the overall objective is preventing the vaccine preventable diseases among both adults, elders, along with the childhood. So that is the objective. And at the same time we must address the vaccine hesitancy as well, because see, during COVID-19 pandemic times also there were several negative concerns with respect to the vaccine. Okay, so because there were certain rumors also with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine, so that has been a leading cause of this vaccine hesitancy problem. So we must tackle this vaccine hesitancy issue. So efforts to combat vaccine hesitancy through a proactive communication strategies, education campaigns, engagement with the healthcare professionals are very, very important. So we must engage with the healthcare professionals, and at the same time we must run the education campaigns and communication strategies to curb this vaccine hesitancy, because they can play a crucial role in ensuring the widespread acceptance of adult vaccination. See, adult vaccination is very, very important because it would reduce the morbidity and the mortality, and at the same time it would also reduces out of pocket healthcare expenditure in a country like India. And at the same time, alternatively, we must promote research and evidence generation as well, because research generation or research should be conducted and understand the burden of vaccine preventable diseases in the adult population and informing policy decisions and program implementation. All these factors would actually help us further strengthen existing immunization and vaccination programs in India. So the next important news article is with respect to the street vendors in India. Okay, street vendors are one of the most vulnerable category that we see in India. And at the same time, if you look at the street vendors, majority of these street vendors are actually migrant population. They are poor and they also live in poor conditions, and at the same time they also face the problem of inadequate incomes. So that is the major problem that these street vendors have been facing. So in order to protect these street vendors, in order to further expand the umbrella of safety and security for these street vendors, the union government has passed the Street Vendors Protection of Their Livelihoods and Regulation of Street Vending Act 2014. Okay, so this particular legislation was passed by the union government in 2014, and it marks a significant milestone in legal recognition of street vendors. So all the street vendors would be recognized by this particular legislation, and their rights would be recognized as per this legislation. However, a decade after its enactment, challenges in its implementation have come to the forefront. So there are a number of challenges, and those challenges have come to the forefront, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, making them, these street vendors, more and more vulnerable. Okay, so now we will understand what are the challenges in implementation of this particular street vendors, protection of their livelihoods, and at the same time regulation of Street Vending Act 2014. So there are certain administrative challenges that the street vendors have been facing. So what are those administrative challenges that they have been facing? So first, there has been an increased harassment and evictions that are actually reported with respect to the street vendors, because understand that most of the street vendors, they do their business on the roadsides. So illegal, they are very often considered as illegal encroachments, and the bureaucracy or even the police very often harass them, okay, since they set up their businesses on the roadside. So therefore, despite emphasis on protection by this particular legislation of the street vendors, these street vendors have been facing heightened harassment and the challenge of eviction in the name of illegal encroachment, often due to the bureaucratic perceptions. So that is where they have been facing a lot of challenges, because when a street vendor set up his shop roadside, this is a temporary in nature, and if someone from the government comes and they order to evict this particular place, then he would lose his livelihood, right? So the street vendor would lose his livelihood, so thereby pushing back him into the cycle of poverty and hunger, because most of the street vendors are migrant populations. They migrate from rural areas to urban areas for better livelihood opportunities. Okay, so due to this bureaucratic perceptions, very often we experience the increased harassment and evictions that are being experienced by these street vendors. And at the same time, there is a lack of awareness and sensitization also on the part of bureaucracy, on the part of civil servants, and on the part of the general public as well. So this lack of awareness and sensitization towards the street vendors actually one of the challenge for them. Okay, the state authorities, the public, and the vendors actually lack. For example, when we talk about vendors, so they are also a stakeholders, and the problem is that the vendors don't know about their legal rights. They don't know about their legal rights, and that is where the problem actually starts. And even public also lack awareness about these street vendors. So when these street vendors have awareness about this particular legislation that was passed in the year 2014, so they will be able to defend themselves, and they will be able to safeguard and protect their rights as well. So because of lack of awareness and sensitization on the part of public, and street vendors have been creating a lot of implementation gaps in this legislation, so that is passed to protect the street vendors. And at the same time, there is also a weak representation of the town vending committees, a weak representation for these street vendors in the town vending committees, because most of the street vendors are not aware of this town vending committees, and they were not given the representation in town vending committees. When they were given the representation in town vending committees, they will be able to raise their grievances, the problems that they have been facing, the challenges that they have been going through. So they can raise those challenges and accordingly get them addressed. But the street vendor representation in these town vending committees, they are known as TVCs, town vending committees, there's a less representation and they lack influence, and representation of women vendors remain a very less. Okay, so that is where the problem also starts for the street vendors. Okay, so street vendors contribution include source of income, revenue generation, employment opportunities, and rising urban economy. These are some of the contributions from the street vendors. So there are certain governance challenges also that these street vendors have been facing. So what are those governance challenges? Because there are certain weak urban governance mechanisms. So these weak urban governance mechanisms are actually creating a lot of trouble for the street vendors. So the act integration with the urban governance frameworks. Now this act, Street Vendors Act, was passed. This Street Vendors Act has actually been integrated with the urban governance frameworks. So uh, this particular Street Vendors Act is not integrated with the urban governance frameworks, and urban local bodies also lack sufficient powers and capacities to implement this particular legislation as well, and that is where the problem also comes here. And after that, there is also a neglect in the urban development schemes. So there are a lot of urban development schemes. For example, if we can talk about urban development schemes, there are programs like National Urban Livelihoods Mission. Okay, so that further strengthens and protects the livelihoods of the urban poor people. National Urban Livelihoods Mission. So initiatives like Smart Cities Mission prioritize infrastructure development over the street vendors inclusion, and it undermines the act's provisions. And after that, there is also an exclusionary nature of urban development. Now when I say the exclusionary nature of urban development, it is essentially means that the urban development has not been taking into the developmental needs of all sections of the people who are living in the urban areas. So there are prevailing notions that world-class cities actually marginalize the street vendors and thereby hindering their recognition as legitimate urban contributors. Okay, so these are some of the challenges that the street vendors have been facing, and apart from that, there are some other challenges that the street vendors have been facing. They include, they very often lack access to the microfinance facilities by the banks, and secondly, they are migrant people to from rural areas to urban areas. So therefore their living conditions are also very poor. So after that, most of these street vendors lack education, lack awareness about their rights, and that is where they are becoming more and more vulnerable to the institutional corruption and insensitive bureaucracy. So after that, they also facing the problem of poverty. So the evictions of these street vendors by the bureaucracy very often push them into the cycle of poverty, and they have also facing the problem of unemployment, and they are not able to cope up with the urban culture and low income consumption, and at the same time resistance are some of the challenges the street vendors have been facing. So after that, they also facing certain social challenges. Okay, so they are also come up with certain societal challenges. For example, exclusionary urban imagery, because now if you look at urban centers image as world class cities, they actually stigmatize street vendors, viewing them as an obstacle for the development rather than a contributor for the urban development. Okay, so we very often hear the comments from the people in urban areas that these street vendors occupy the every place, thereby they are hindering, or they are like an obstacle for the urban development, rather than recognizing the contribution for the economy that these street vendors make. What we have been doing, the societal perception is negative towards the street vendors, and that is in line with the exclusionary urban image. And at the same time, the impact of climate change and technological advancements also having a huge impact on the street vendors and their livelihoods. For example, a regular heat wave like a condition, that these street vendors are more vulnerable because they do not have any institutionalized, or they do not have any infrastructure, because they're more vulnerable. So therefore they are also face the problem of heat wave, and climate change is one of the key concern that they have been facing. And apart from that, they're also facing stiff competition from the e-commerce companies, and reduced incomes is another challenge, and required innovative solutions also, so that they can be able to withstand themselves, and at the same time they can also be able to earn a lot of respect from the people in those urban centers. And after that, the thing is that they should be aware about their rights. So that has being provided, the legal rights that are being provided by the Street Vendors Protection of Livelihoods and Regulation of Street Vending Act 2014. So they must aware of the rights that are being provided by this particular legislation. So in this context, we must need measures for measures for adaptation, and we must also take some welfare oriented measures. So this particular act's provisions must be creatively utilized to address the emerging challenges and at the same time ensure the welfare of the street vendors, and this is a way forward with respect to the street vendors, because we have created a legislation, and that will have a huge impact on the lives and livelihoods of the street vendors. That is a good thing to do, but at the same time, if we do not implement that particular legislation for the benefit of street vendors, then there is no the purpose of bringing such a legislation would not be served. So therefore, the act provisions must be creatively utilized to address the emerging challenges, and at the same time we have to ensure the welfare of street vendors as well. So the next important news article is with respect to the redistribution of wealth in India. See, concentration of wealth and inequalities, both income inequalities and regional inequalities, have become more common and more prevalent in India. And in fact, we are going for the 18th general elections, and in this 18th general elections, during the campaigns of these political parties, the wealth inequalities have become more common. Okay, so concentration of wealth is one of the key aspect of these political campaigns. So because of that reason, apart from that, we should also understand the wealth concentration has been further increasing. The rich become richer and poor become poorer. Okay, now we'll understand some of the judgments of the Supreme Court with respect to the concentration of wealth and how concentration of wealth violates some of the provisions of the Indian Constitution. So the Supreme Court has constituted a 9-judge bench to interpret the directive principles of state policy. Okay, so that is with respect to the ownership and control of the material resources by the people. For that particular purposes, the Supreme Court has constituted a 9-judge bench. So what does Constitution says about the concentration of wealth? Okay, so if you carefully look at the preamble of the Indian Constitution, so preamble of Indian Constitution aims to secure to all citizens social, economic justice, liberty and equality. Okay, so that also covers the economic equality, because economic equality will further ensure the social equality. So that is very, very important here. So however, the part 3 of the Constitution actually lists down some of the fundamental rights that guarantee liberty, equality, while part 4 of the Indian Constitution that contains directive principles of state policy. This directive principles of state policy actually aimed at ensuring or providing welfare state in India. Okay, so they actually aimed at ensuring welfare state in India. So 1 minute. Yes, sorry. So directive principles of state policy would actually provide for the welfare state in our country. However, these principles, the directive principles of state policy, that the central government at the same time the state government should follow to achieve social and economic justice in the country. Okay, so both central government and state governments must follow the directive principles of state policy while implementing or framing or evaluating the existing policies. So in fact, Article 39 Clause B specifically talks about the concentration of wealth. Okay, so Article 39 Clause B and Clause C of Part 4 of the Directive Principles of State Policy contains certain principles that are aimed at securing economic justice in the country. So in fact, they also provide that the ownership and control of the material resources of the society should be distributed to serve the common good, and at the same time the operation of the economic system that doesn't result in the concentration of wealth or to the common detriment. So please remember that yesterday there was a question that concentration of wealth violates which of the following provisions. So the concentration of wealth violates the directive principles of state policy, because Article 39 Clause B and 39 Clause C talks about the concentration of wealth. So the operation of the economic system should not result in the concentration of wealth, and it is the responsibility of the state to prevent the concentration of wealth and at the same time the increasing inequalities. Okay, so in this context, the bench of the Supreme Court earlier said that the distinction between the community resources held in trust by present generation for future generations and privately owned by property or privately owned property. So community property would include natural resources, as these two are held in trust for the future generations. Okay, so this Article 39B talks about the concentration of wealth. So if you look at some historical context of this concentration of wealth, Indian Constitution originally guaranteed the right to property as a fundamental right under Article 19 Clause 1 and subclause F. Okay, so Article 19 Indian Constitution originally provided for the right to property, but now right to property is not part of the fundamental rights. Now it has it provided under Article 31 that the state shall pay compensation in case of acquisition of the private property under Article 31 of the Indian Constitution. However, in Golaknath case of 1967, the Supreme Court held that fundamental rights cannot be abridged or diluted to implement the DPSPs. So this is what the Supreme Court has said in Golaknath case of 1968. So we cannot take away or abridge the existing fundamental rights to implement the directive principles of state policy. However, subsequently in Keswanand Bharati case of 1973, the Supreme Court has actually held that, so that is a 13-judge bench, one of the largest bench that Indian judiciary had ever seen. So the 13-judge bench of the Supreme Court upheld the validity of Article 31C, but made it a subject of judicial review. And at the same time, in Minerva Mills case of 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that Constitution exists on harmonious balance between the fundamental rights and directive principles. So this is very, very important. So in this particular judgment, the Minerva Mills case of 1980, the Supreme Court has actually established a harmonious coexistence between both fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. Okay, so they should work together and they are correlative to each other, and that is what the Supreme Court has said in the Minerva Mills case of 1980. However, in 1987, in order to avoid excessive litigation directly filed in the Supreme Court by the propertied class. Now what happens at that time, because the state wanted to dilute the properties of the certain sections of the society. Okay, so for that the government has passed 44th constitutional amendment, and that has omitted right to property from the fundamental rights. So as I have already told you that Article 19(1) and subclause F talks about the right to privacy, that is right to property. The original Indian Constitution talks about this right to property, but 44th Constitutional Amendment Act actually omitted right to property as a fundamental right and made it a constitutional right by including it in Article 300A. So in fact, right to private property continues to be an important constitutional cum legal right as of now. So please remember that the right to privacy is a constitutional right, it is not a fundamental right, and at the same time it is also a legal right. Now any law that the state passes to acquire the private property should only be for the public purpose, and adequate compensation must be provided by the state in case of any such acquisition. Now, what is the current debate? So current debate is that, in fact, if you look at Indian government after independence, initially first 4 decades we have followed the socialistic model of economy. So as part of the socialistic model of economy, what we have done, so we have started acquiring the properties, or the central and state governments have been making laws to dilute the properties of the rich propertied class. Okay, so this particular policy of the government aimed at reducing inequalities and redistribution of existing wealth, so thereby it would prevent the concentration of wealth in a few families or few sections of the society, and we can redistribute the wealth among the poorer sections of the society who constitute the majority of population in our country, thereby fulfilling the objective of Article 39 clause 1 and subclause F, so that directs the state to prevent the concentration of wealth. Okay, so in fact, if you look at the statistics or data, the World Inequality Lab actually states that top 10 percentage in India, or India's population, they are wealthy population, right? So they actually have a share of 65 to 57 percentage of the wealth and income respectively in the year 2022. See, whenever you write any answer on income inequalities or wealth inequalities in India, you must present this data in the introduction, so that will give a very good impression over your answer. So the bottom 50 percentage on the other hand have a meager share of just 6.5 to 15%. So this has been indicating the stark inequalities that are prevalent in India, and in fact the government's failure to prevent the concentration of wealth. Because if you can look at India's inequality statistics, 10% of India's population own more than 65% of the total wealth and income. Okay, so what should be the way forward in this context? So the way forward is that innovation and growth should not be curtailed in the name of preventing concentration of wealth, but at the same time the benefits of economic growth should reach all sections of the society and including marginalized sections, and that is how we can ensure an inclusive growth and inclusive development. Okay, so after that the policies may vary and need to be framed after adequate debate in line with the current economic models. And at the same time, it's not just in India that the inequalities are at its peak, but across the world we have seen these inequalities, such as countries like Brazil, countries like South Africa. So they have more inequalities than in India. So therefore these inequalities have been growing worldwide, and that has been a major concern. And in this context, it is a responsibility of the governments to protect the interests of the poorer sections by preventing the concentration of wealth, and at the same time redistributing wealth among the poorer sections of the society and marginalized sections of the society, because they're mostly dependent on the state machinery for their livelihood options. Okay, so this is what this article has been talking about. And the next important news article is with respect to the methane emissions. Please understand, methane is one of the most potential greenhouse gases, right? So most potential and potent greenhouse gas. So it has been contributing to the increasing global temperatures. However, the concern is that burning of fossil fuels, not burning of fossil fuels, rather extraction of fossil fuels actually contribute to the methane in the atmosphere, and at the same time the poultry industry, cattle rearing and farming, especially the paddy cultivation, are actually the major contributors of methane in the atmosphere. Okay, so since methane is a potential greenhouse gas, so that is being associated with increasing global temperatures, thereby further driving climate change, it is a concern, and how we can reduce the emissions of methane into the atmosphere, thereby fulfilling our existing climate obligations and at the same time reducing the level of global warming. So in recent times, the concentration of methane in the atmosphere is a concern, right? So if you look at the trends of concentration of methane in the atmosphere, so it changed from time to time. So in 1990s, up to 1990s, the concentration actually increased. Then it started stabilizing for a bit, and then it started increase again. So around 2007. So according to recent estimates, the anthropogenic concentration of methane today is 3 times of what it was in 300 years ago. Okay, so the concentration of methane in the atmosphere has been rising at an exceptional pace. Now, so if you look at some of the statistics with respect to methane emissions, methane is the second most abundant anthropogenic greenhouse gas after the carbon dioxide. So we all knew the potency of the carbon dioxide in creating or increasing global warming. But at the same time, if you look at methane, methane is the second largest greenhouse gas after the carbon dioxide. So both carbon dioxide and methane have been exceptionally warming this planet, thereby contributing for the global warming and climate change. However, over a century, methane has global warming potential of 28 times greater than the CO2. Okay, so the total potential of methane in warming the atmosphere is more than the carbon dioxide. So that is a cause of concern here. And in fact, at the United Nations climate talks in 2021, all the member countries have launched this global methane pledge. So what was the target of this global methane pledge? The target was to reduce the methane emissions into the atmosphere, because methane is a major contributor of the climate change. It is a major contributor of the global warming. So therefore, the global methane tracker was launched by all the countries at UN climate talks in 2021 to reduce emissions of methane into the atmosphere. So all these countries aimed at cutting down the methane emissions, and at the same time they wanted to slow down the planet's warming because of methane and carbon dioxide. And in fact, the microbes are actually one of the biggest source of producing methane into the atmosphere, but not the burning of fossil fuels, because microbes, the soil microbes which are present in the soils, are actually responsible for the production of large scale methane. And what are the sources of methane? Please make sure that you understood the sources of methane, because they are very important. Now, what are the sources of methane? When fossil fuels such as natural gas and oil are being extracted, so when these fossil fuels are being extracted from the reserves, underground resource, the deep within the earth's crust, the thermogenic methane is being released, and biogenic methane comes from the microbial action. So methane is actually two types. So one is thermogenic methane, and that thermogenic methane is released when we extract fossil fuels from the beneath or deep inside earth's crust. On the other hand, the biogenic methane is released through the microbial action. And in fact, there are certain microbes which can produce methane, and they are known as archaea or archaea. And they are actually the single-celled microorganisms, and they are very different from the bacteria and the eukaryotes, and they are called as methanogens. So those microbes are actually called as methanogens because they produce methane. They emit methane into the atmosphere. And in fact, these methanogens thrive in the oxygen deficient environments. So why we say that the paddy fields are actually responsible for the release of large scale emissions into the atmosphere? Why? Because if you look at India's traditional paddy farming, so the paddy fields are actually flooded with the water. So when these paddy fields are flooded with the water, so they can create the oxygen deficient environments, and in these oxygen deficient environments the methanogens would thrive. And apart from that, the digestive tracts of animals the wetlands, rice paddies, landfills, sediments of lakes and oceans are actually create the oxygen deficient environments, and in these oxygen deficient environments the methanogens would thrive and they produce increasing amounts of methane into the atmosphere. And apart from that, these methanogens are also play or they also play crucial role in global carbon cycle. Why? Because they convert the existing organic matter into methane and release methane into the atmosphere, thereby further increasing the global warming. So in fact, methane is a potential greenhouse gas. Its production by methanogens is an essential part of the natural ecosystem. But in recent times, due to anthropogenic factors, the methanogens have been producing exceptionally high amounts of methane, and high amounts of methane in the atmosphere are actually responsible for the further heating of the planet. So, but human activities like agriculture, dairy farming, fossil fuel production have further increased the overall methane emissions into the atmosphere, and they have also been increasing the global warming. So in fact, the methane emissions from the fossil fuels are actually declining. They started declining between 1990s and 2000s, but now they are stable. Okay, so microbes were producing more methane than the fossil fuel produce, so therefore it is a concern and that must be taken care of if we wanted to reduce the methane emissions, or if we wanted to achieve the objectives of this global methane initiative that aims to cut down the emissions of methane. So to reduce methane, anthropogenic activity should be first controlled, like waste, landfills management, rice fields, and enteric fermentation, oil, gas and coal. So those things must be taken care of to reduce the methane production or methane emissions into the atmosphere, so thereby controlling the global warming and associated climate change. Okay, so that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much, and we will meet in the next news analysis. So please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.